Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. Today on the show, the most popular, highest rated panel conversation of all the panel conversations we have. Making their world record 8th appearance on the Herle Burly, I give you the Chiefs. 3 former chiefs of staff to some of Canada's most accomplished heads of government, here to discuss the issues not just as campaigners do, i.e. what might be ideal in a political sense, but rather what's possible to deliver in a governing sense. The Chiefs are Tim Murphy, former Chief of Staff to Paul Martin, now the EVP and Chief Strategic Affairs Officer at AECON. Ian Brodie, first Chief of Staff to Stephen Harper and central to the founding of the CPC, now Professor of Political Science at the University of Calgary. And Brian Topp, former Chief of Staff to Rachel Notley in Alberta, Deputy Chief to Roy Romano in Saskatchewan, one of the architects of Jack Layton's Orange Wave. Today, he's a founding partner at GT & Co. For a brand new federal government, hell-bent on breaking down barriers and red tape at record speed, this is a timely conversation. I want to talk about what's changed in Prime Minister Carney's government, how's it operating, how's it structured, and an early progress report on how it's managing a very ambitious agenda. Brian, Ian, Tim, 8th time's a charm. Maybe we should give you your own damn show on this air quotes thing.
Howdy, Dave. Welcome from Stampede City.
Hello from Regina, center of the universe.
Hello from Mississauga. I won't describe it.
Yeah.
Nothing further needs to be said there.
Well, you know, you're all in great locations, but only one of you is going to have a delicious pizza tonight, and that is Brian Topp.
That's true.
Yeah. Because Regina has the world's best pizza. You may or may not know this. Some people in Windsor, in Canada, may squeal about this, but they're wrong, and Italians can go fuck themselves, right? Because the Greeks in Regina know how to make a pizza.
Yes, they do. Although I have to tell you, our plan, for old time's sake, is to go to Golf's.
Oh, you want a steak?
This is the place for it, you know, Saskatchewan beef. Alberta beef, excellent, but Saskatchewan, Yeah. So,
I'll let that pass.
You know, I think their garlic bread's better than their steak, and I'm not sure if you want to say that about a steakhouse, really. Okay, so listen, I just want to start. So, I haven't actually personally seen anything quite like the pace at which Mark Carney took over the government of Canada. And seemingly bent it to his own will, imposed an entirely new policy agenda that was quite different in many respects from the agenda that the bureaucracy was implementing and that the government before had been putting in place, changing relationships internationally, dealing with Trump, changing relationships with the provinces, having meetings with the premiers, developing. It all seems at breakneck speed and very, very impressive to me. But, you know, I'm a fanboy and a partisan. So, Ian, what's your take on the Carney start? I mean, I one last thing I want to say, and Tim, this is especially for you. I really don't think I've seen an example of somebody take over a government from a different leader and change it as much as quickly as he has.
Well, David, I got the summary this morning. Canada's new government access regulation cuts spending in order to make Canada an energy superpower. We are trying to undo the last 10 years of damage to Canadian economic policy and to Canadian society. I'll say there, you know, time was of the essence. People voted for, you know, before he took the reins of power before the election. People wanted an indication there was big change coming. Mr. Poilievre had made, I think, a compelling case to throw the Trudeau government to the curb. And unfortunately for Mr. Poilievre, Liberals delivered big change, quickly before he had a chance to make his case against Mr. Carney. Lots of announcements and some important legislative victories before the Parliament rose for the summer. No budget, which I think is, frankly, is a demerit on Carney's report card here, because he was fully capable of presenting a budget before that. But that said, I don't want that to detract from some big international developments on G7 and dealings with Mr. Trump, a big piece of legislation through the House and through the Senate. He showed, I think, flexibility, or his team showed flexibility in taking some opposition amendments on that bill in order to get it through the House more quickly, which I think was a smart thing to do. Question now is, over the summer, a new agenda for the fall, or expansion of the agenda for the fall. I gather we're going to get some criminal justice stuff. That'll be another big challenge for Conservatives if Mr. Carney is able to move to the center on criminal justice off of kind of a very progressive criminal justice agenda of the previous government, and then into implementation. Headlines last week to message to the civil service: get on my page, or you'll find yourself out of work. I think only a Liberal can say that to the civil service and not have Canada 2020 issue 8 pounds of Ralph Heinzman papers about how terrible that is to Canadian democracy. But frankly, I'll have to give credit again where credit due. Overdue. And so now the question is delivery between now and Christmas. I still think Mr. Carney gets at least until Christmas, maybe another year and a half of pretty attractive coverage. And I think he can get away with just about anything that he wants to do in his governing agenda for the next 8 or 12 months.
Tim, what's your take on how he started? And you are somebody that came in the middle. You replaced Mr. Martin, replaced Mr. Kretschmann, but Martin came in with an entire team of people experienced in government that moved right into slots, right?
Yeah.
And so you can understand how that thing hit the ground running. But Carney had nothing.
No, well, I would say he both had an advantage and a disadvantage in comparison to the circumstances we had, which is, Paul Martin had been part of the Kretschmann government. So, there was an opportunity for some change, but it was going to be, changing, a few degrees the direction, some bits here and there. Mark Carney comes in with the opportunity without any of the baggage really of the Trudeau era, and had the opportunity to say, well, we're getting rid of the carbon tax, we're getting rid of the capital gains tax, without any real baggage for it. I would say it was, he did all of that fairly quickly in the context of, by and large, a very, bare bones PMO staff, a PCO and bureaucracy that was largely, the last government's. And so I think, interesting enough, it speaks to me actually about the degree to which both our politics and frankly the way our government runs has become so leader prime ministerial centric that's possible, right? That it's that someone can come in at the top of the food chain and say, well, we were heading this way yesterday, but we're going this way now. And people go, okay. Right now, I think it also speaks, though, to what Ian raised, which was the appetite for change was significant. The appetite for real action on the economy was significant. And frankly, that was true within the Liberal Party itself, right? There were large swaths of the party, I think, that were of the view that the economy had not had anywhere near the right kind of attention or sufficient attention and was hungry for that. So I think, and I think frankly, that was reflected in the broader, reaction to the government. But I also do think that what, interestingly, also for me, was the notion that an adult in the room, there was an appetite for that, right? There was a bit of a sense that, I think that both the previous prime minister and Pierre Poilievre were engaged in a different kind of politics, one that obviously this current kind of social media environment encourages, but that there was an appetite for someone coming in and showing kind of, calm, measured, experienced, adult-like behavior. And I actually think he's evinced that in the role. And even in circumstance, I was thinking about the retreat on the digital sales tax measure. Yeah. And, there were a little gnashing of teeth around the edges, but I think by and large, he got away with it because most of the Canadians go, he's the adult. I'm sure he had good reason. Next. And so I think that is a phenomenal achievement, to be able to create yourself the room to be trusted in the decision-making methodology. I don't think we've seen that.
It's partly who he is, right, Tim? No I mean, I've been making the case that he's more different from Trudeau than Poilievre is. That Poilievre and Trudeau have more in common with each other than Carney has with either one of them. So, and I think that goes to what you're saying, which is people wanted something very different.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he came, my question always was the guy had the right CV for the moment. The question was the man going to measure up to the CV? And frankly, he's more than done that so far.
Last week, I closed the message in this space with a firm WTF. In the context of the new federal government's proposed legislation to tear down interprovincial trade barriers and create a strong single Canadian economy, I told you the story of incumbent telecoms who lobbied and formally petitioned Cabinet to overturn an exhaustively reviewed CRTC decision, one that provided wholesale fiber access in Ontario and Quebec to our presenting sponsor, TELUS. How those incumbent telecoms were working hard to restrict competition, shrink consumer choice, and keep those outdated trade barriers firmly in place for their own benefit. Well, friends, buckle up for more WTF on this file. The cabinet petitioner trying to restrict TELUS in this story is Cogeco. Cogeco themselves wholesale on TELUS's wireless network infrastructure in Cogeco's incumbent territory, which means TELUS provides access to their own wireless network so that Cogeco can offer mobility services bundled with their broadband. And before you say, well, TELUS is a great big monolithic brand and Cogeco is just a regional player, even after 2.5 years reselling internet in Ontario and Quebec, TELUS has a combined market share of 1/3 the size of Cogeco's. TELUS is a fraction of Cogeco's size in the East. Anyway, the irony is a bit thick. Cogeco petitions Cabinet to stop TELUS from using their eastern competitors' wirelines to wholesale fiber internet services while they happily and profitably ride TELUS's wireless network. Their latest reporting shows solid internet subscriber growth and strong, stable revenue. What it comes down to is this: there's a gap in values and purpose here, and the Canadian consumer is at the heart of it. TELUS believes in real competition. They behave and invest in ways that strengthen the Canadian economy through the removal of trade barriers. So, in the end, more innovative products and services come to market at better prices, and consumers win. As we await Cabinet's decision, that's hopefully how this story ends. There's more than enough WTF in the world right now without it. Brian, how does it all look out there in Regina?
Oh, it's beautiful here in Regina, as it always is, David, as you know.
Yeah.
But look, on the topic we're discussing,
is it a mosquito day or a windy day?
It's sunny it's sunny, hot, and calm.
Okay, right. It's a
Perfect
mosquito
for
day.
camping, what we're about to do. So look, I would draw a comparison between the early months of this government and the election campaign that got him to office. In the first half of that election campaign, the focus was on President Trump. And when President Trump was talking, it was obvious that there was a very serious crisis, and Mr. Carney was obviously the right person to address it. And he was clear and crisp and prime minister-y, the adult in the room. We didn't have to listen to any rhyming nursery rhymes anymore. We didn't have to listen to our feelings. He looked like the man of the moment. The second half of the campaign, basically because Trump kind of went quiet, because I think the White House understood that they were driving politics in Canada to some extent, and they were killing their co-religionists in this country by talking up. And the apparent crisis that the country was facing started to tone down. Then kind of Mr. Carney and his team kind of seemed to drift a little bit. You discussed this in some of your other paneling, and they kind of seemed to lose their thread a little bit. So when we were drifting into normality, if you will, and into normal domestic politics, then it was less obvious that Carney was the man of the moment. And I think I would say that so far, in what we've seen in the government, that continues. And so when we look, for example, at the way Mr. Carney has played his excellent network in Europe into doing exactly what we have to do, which is, look, Canada cannot prevail in a serious trade war against the United States of America by ourselves. And the United States understands that, not only with regard to Canada, but all its other counterparties, which is why Trump attacks multilateral organizations and wants to deal with other countries one-on-one, where he's always the bully. And so the answer to this is to find allies. And so the exactly right thing to do is to build a relationship with Europe And the early visits to Europe, the self-confidence and clarity and substance of the reach out to Europe, is enormously to his credit, and it builds the case that confronted by the Trump threat, that this guy is on his game, ready for prime time from a standing start. Now, look, with regard to this bill, the project bill that went through the House that Ian was talking about, I'm a lot less impressed than you guys are by this. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think it's more show than reality, to be honest with you. Look, when we were working on energy infrastructure issues in the government of Alberta, federal legislation was not the issue. We were not saying we have enormous problems with federal legislation and it all has to be simplified and we need the federal government to work to a 2-year mandate and blah blah blah, all the other stuff that they were saying. The issue with energy infrastructure and major projects was the courts. It was the ability of counterparties to just judicialize regulatory decisions, to challenge them in the courts and to appeal to them, and that has not changed, especially in British Columbia, where the reality of Aboriginal legal position in that province is highly in flux, and therefore the courts are trying to find their way through it. The court rulings on the Northern Gateway and then the consequent court ruling on Trans Mountain Pipeline, those were the issues, those were the rules, those were the playbooks that people had to deal with. So what I'm trying to say is that outside of the crisis, I think the jury's out on whether this is a new Superman government. And I think there's less than meets the eye to the show pony bill that went through at the end there.
Just to keep up with that, and maybe everybody can else jump in too. I mean, I think that everybody has considered that the Tim Hodgson appointment to NRCan is a significant one, and significant not just because he obviously has the confidence of the Prime Minister, but because apparently has a track record at Hydro One, where he was the chair in Ontario, of getting major projects built, and getting them built because he's developed an economic participation formula for First Nations that they like. Do you put any stock in that, Brian?
Yes, I do. There's no question. And look, the credit there goes to him and as well to the executive team over at Hydro One, who are pretty good and focused on this. There's no question that Hydro One has become an expert center, like the Trans Mountain Pipeline team were, by the way, under Don Farrell, in threading through the Aboriginal title issues and the need for Aboriginal partnership, understanding what the First Nations people are saying about watching resource projects happening on their land, which they have no benefit from, and the need to cure this. And so he, I think, comes into his position with lots of smarts on getting projects done. But I'm going to stick to my song here that when he is tackling that, federal legislation and what bureaucrats do and when they show up for work and what deadlines they run and are they wearing ties and all the other stuff that everybody's fussing about in Ottawa right now is not the issue. It's the complex jurisdictional situation in Canada, how provinces play, and critically the courts.
You know, Tim Murphy, nothing serious happens in brown shoes.
Yes.
If you're serious, if you're going to make a serious deal, you are wearing black shoes. Do you agree with that, Ian?
Yes. Let me say, I mean, let me just extend Brian's comments, maybe, because I didn't want to give the impression that I was prepared to give the government a completely free pass here. With the precipitous decline of the NDP, there's no question that Jagmeet Singh is the biggest destroyer of political capital since Kim Campbell. And Kim Campbell's maybe a special case of having basically seeded a party off into complete destruction.
Although, wait, can I just hurt Brian just a little bit? Can I hurt Brian just a little bit?
More than that?
The legendary Alan Blakeney is quoted as saying the political graveyards of Canada are strewn with people who've underestimated the Liberal Party.
Yes, true. Maybe parts of me too.
I was at the Ledge today looking at his painting and looking at the other paintings of the premiers. They're absolutely beautiful. And looking at Alan, and it's funny that you raised this. I was thinking about him this morning. He was a pretty smart guy.
Yes, he was. Sorry, back to you, Ian.
Yeah, look, with I mean, the NDP had sort of an epically bad election, now into a leadership campaign, and I assume a bankruptcy filing shortly. So I'm serious about that. Having been through the remnants of party restructuring myself at one point, the left of the Liberal government is completely open for reoccupation, and yet Mr. Carney's moved, at least on economic issues, to the right. And I think he's going to get away with it. The NDP is going to occupy just enough of that space to give him a free pass. Yes, there's problems with the major projects legislation, but for the time being, there seems to be some kind of reflection of a national coalition unanimity on getting these projects done. As a result, I actually think for people who have a particular conception of Indigenous participation here that's reinforced by the courts are not going to get in the way of this. I think the Supreme Court realizes that it would be substantially off of a major national consensus that includes, the Liberals, the Globe and Mail, the CBC, and all of the provincial governments. And there's just no way the Supreme Court's going to get in the way of that. So I think there is the prospect of stuff getting made here. That's getting built here. That said, it is kind of an unmanageable political coalition for the Liberals here. And at some point, as Mr. Carney makes unpopular decisions, I started by talking about his sort of instruction. We're going to have 25% cut in the federal government's budget over the course of the next 2 years, and then a bunch of regulations that are going to get axed. Every dollar of that spending and every one of those regulations has a political coalition.
Of its operational spending.
Well, sure, but operational spending is spending. And as you guys know, every dollar of operational spending has some kind of political coalition behind it. The regulations have coalitions behind them. As he moves through that, it's not that I think this is not at least 10 years overdue. I think it is, but it's going to come at a cost. It's going to come at a cost of political forces pulling away from the Carney government. But I think that's, again, I think this is at least 8 months away and possibly 18 months away from having any downward consequences for him. I think he's got this moment and he's going to run with it. I'm not sure that all of the promises, people's optimism about it's going to pay off for this group, that group, or some other group are going to succeed. They almost certainly won't. But it doesn't matter. We come off of 10 years of social justice on the social side and zero growth on the economic side, and the country could not survive that. We're going into what could be some internationally very difficult economic waters, with the country in the weakest economic position it's been in more than a generation, and that just could not continue. I think he's the man to, he's pressing ahead to try to show that he's the man for pressuring the Canadian economy ahead.
So, back in 1997, the late Harry Bruce wrote a book called The Pig That Flew. Harry was an awfully good writer, and the book was a crackling bit of Canadiana. It was the story of the struggle to privatize our sponsor, Canadian National. The term pig, like dog, was stock market hyperbole. It was the flying part that got really interesting. CN was for many years a crown corporation, and back in the 20th century, crown corporations tended to be playthings for politicians, more concerned with sinking government spending into their ridings than they were with efficient operations or healthy balance sheets. So eventually, the progressive conservative government of Brian Mulroney tilled the ground for privatizing CN, and exactly 30 years ago this coming weekend, on the watch of then Finance Minister Paul Martin, the act that transformed CN into a publicly held, fully commercial company was passed into law. On Bay Street and Wall Street, analysts sneered and ridiculed, but those in the know knew the railway had been reborn. The initial public offering of CN stock raised $2.25 billion for the taxpayers of Canada. It was the most successful in Canadian history. And the so-called experts who'd yelled pig and dog and presumably advised clients not to buy were proven spectacularly wrong. Anyone who purchased $1,000 of CN stock back then would be sitting on about $63,000 today. That, people, is because CN has become one of the most successful competitive railways in the world, moving all manner of cargo from the west coast of Canada to the east coast and down the Mississippi to the Gulf and all points in between. CN flew all right. Boy, did it fly. So congratulations to the railway on 30 years of excellence since privatization. Whatever solutions lie ahead for our economy, they will move on the tracks of Canadian National. Tim, when I look at it, I really worry about how he's going to keep the momentum going on the build agenda. Because when I look at my public opinion research, I see the same issues I saw in November. Cost of housing, cost of groceries, cost of other essentials, right? Crime, all kinds of domestic things that are really grinding away at people. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't agree with the macro front, and people acknowledge to me in polls, listen, we have to take the economy more seriously than we've been taking it in this country, right? And so there's I think a lot of patience for that, but nonetheless, I worried that it couldn't be solely that, and I worried that that other side of the agenda would start to crash into them and bog down the government and slow down the government. But on the other hand, you could argue this is a hell of a lot like 95.
Yeah.
Where there is no left-wing opposition in Parliament and really not much of a left-wing option in politics. And so the Liberal Party, opposed by people that would do more of what they're doing than what they're doing, can do a lot it might normally not be able to get it, or that any government might normally not be able to get away with.
So I agree with that completely, which is why I disagree with Brian a little bit about the impact of the Build Canada Act, Bill C5, and the kind of soapbox effort around the issue of creating space for a Build Canada agenda. And your 95 comparison is apt because, as you well know, what Paul Martin did was create basically a constituency for what he did by the use of the public soapbox, right? And to counter the weight of contrary messages, people said, okay, we understand that needs to be done. We support it. It may mean this agenda is not as strong, that agenda, but it's something we think is the right thing to do, or at least enough do that keeps the government. And I think that's a discipline this government needs to follow, and I think they've started down the right path, right? I mean, I to some extent I agree. Bill's C5 was the kind of you're tacking your 96 thesis on the church door, right? You still got a lot of work to do afterwards, and but it's an important part of creating a notion of these things matter. We're really going to be driving towards this from an agenda point of view. This is the dominant thing I'm focused on. I think the challenge actually comes in part two. If we sit there and say, 18 months, 2 years from now, some of the barnacles of governing start to, attach to the ship of state, to really extend the analogy. The question will be, has anything actually been built? Right? That to me is, if I'm in the shoes of the PMO, PCO, that's the thing that scares me. Okay, I've promised big things. We're going to move the agenda. And so I think of it in three ways, right? And part of what he's doing is creating the notion that Canada is a place to come to invest, right? Foreign direct investment actually took a bit of a dive. We weren't that, people weren't quite that strong on Canada. Yeah, I understand. But I just say that because I didn't have the actual figures at hand. But to create us as an attractive place for those global partnerships, to create those multilaterals, to come and invest, and then and so you create a rhetorical position around that. Then you take some of the efforts to focus the public service, to rally governments together to do it. But then he's got to build some things. And obviously, to your point, the Indigenous community is going to be crucial to that. A lot of what we're going to be able to build to diversify our trade and opportunities is actually in the West, North, Arctic, requires Indigenous cooperation. And so he kind of moved a bit quickly for that. He's kind of going back and fixing that up. But stuff's going to have shovels in the ground. And that's the thing that will, from an institutional perspective, keep me awake inside government. And I don't know if they yet know what that is, right? You look at the provinces lists, there's a lot of big things on that, but not a lot of them have shovels in the ground in the next 2 years.
And based on what we're just talking about, the nexus that really concerns me right now is the dead silence on housing.
Yeah.
Absolute months after the election, dead silence on housing, which was one of the signature promises, seemed to be one of the most thought through policy items, and is the part of the build agenda that is most resonant with the ordinary citizen's domestic agenda.
Yeah, but the problem,
Right.
I think part of the challenge, I'll let other speakers say, but I think part of the challenge with that is every jurisdiction's got a finger in this pie and gets in the way of it. A. B, the economics of housing are off, right? And the fix is not very politically palatable. And at the end of the day, what the federal government can do to actually do that is again not easy, right? I agree with you. Like getting some housing built would be great, but if you've got federal land, moving federal land to actual housing on it, like if you don't have some housing actually built in 2 years, and that's an incredibly fast cycle, you've got a problem. I think they're sitting there inside government going, okay, we promised 25 billion. How the heck are we going to actually make that into housing? And I don't think they have the answer to that yet. So I think it's a program and policy design problem right now, and not yet, but could be a real political one.
I think it's worth sticking with my wartime, peacetime thing. So look, what's Trump up to here that makes any damn sense, as opposed to just being a toddler reacting to what he reads on social media?
I don't know, destroying American democracy, liberal democracy. There's that.
Well, let's just stay on the trade issue.
Okay. All right.
So they seem to be pursuing a 10% across the board tariff for all trade partners as a base. And I think what's driving that is that, in effect, what they're doing is sneaking up to a national sales tax in the United States that they're framing as just being paid for by foreigners. But of course, this is like Mexican will pay for the wall, right? The American consumers are going to pay an across the board 10% tax to fund tax cuts for rich people. That's number one. Number two, they are aiming at auto, steel, aluminum, forestry, IT, all very carefully targeted at Michigan, Pennsylvania, and other Rust Belt states, which they need to stay in control of Congress. So they have pursuing a political agenda through this trade war that you saw Trump playing out, for example, when he was in front of the UAW about a month ago, talking about how this was going to look like. That appears to be what's going on. And so our prime minister has given himself a deadline to try to persuade Donald Trump to abandon the principal political tool that he intends to use to stay in control of Congress. So let's put it this way: as long as that's the table stakes, then Canada has a really compelling national interest that everybody of all political stripes should agree on, that we need to reduce our trade dependence on the United States, and we need to build deeper trade relationships with the Asia Pacific and with Europe. I've listened to some discussions about this in various fora, and what people who think about Canadian exports say is that we don't have the infrastructure in this country to divert that much trade to other markets. We don't have the ports, we don't have the railroads, we don't have the warehouses. We are not set up to export to the world. We are set up to go north-south. So if all of these facts remain true, okay, notwithstanding what I'm going to continue to argue is essentially window dressing, because federal legislation wasn't the problem in getting projects through,
Right.
Then there is rocket fuel to get things done. Okay, very similar to a wartime situation. It's like everybody can see that this is something that we have to do. And when you have, a 50% tariff on Canadian auto industry, if that doesn't get the CUSMA exemption, which is, I think, what we're aiming for, then we are going to be in a first-class economic crisis, similar to, certainly the most serious economic crisis we've had since World War II, and we will have to act decisively. And in that circumstance, then I think what Ian said, that the courts will respect that. I think the government understands that they can't just bulldoze First Nations. They're going to have to be partners, equity partners, and so on. And I think you probably will see things getting done. And by the way, that's also how you get housing done. You need a public builder, public lands, public resources, because all the economics in housing speak to build luxury condominiums, and that's not what we need here.
It's summertime, Herle Burly-ites. You know I like a good lemon heart rum and coke. I also really like numbers. That's why I've done polling for over 30 years. Let me share some insights I've gathered from our sponsor, Fidelity Investments Canada. According to industry research, 64% of Canadians say they have investments. Among those investors, 61% hold mutual funds. Mutual funds are by far the most popular savings vehicles for middle-class Canadians. If you invest in mutual funds, you may have noticed that you get a lot of mail. That's because, by securities regulations, mailing paper remains the default method of communication with you. It is estimated that the industry uses 900 tons of paper annually, equivalent to 57 CN towers stacked on top of one another. And when told about this, 83% of Canadians say they want to receive their financial statements electronically. Fidelity completely agrees with the majority of Canadian investors, while still being committed to providing paper options for those who want them. Because Canadians deserve to be informed about how their investments are performing the way they want. And because for Fidelity, performance matters. To find insights like these and more, follow Fidelity Canada on LinkedIn, Instagram, Reddit, and YouTube. He's talked a lot about modular homes, and I've talked to a number of people in the development business who tell me that that would only make sense financially at real scale.
Yeah,
So you
that's right.
have to have a buyer that is ordering a very large number of homes at one time, right?
Now, look,
And
since
so
we
that's got to be government, doesn't it?
I think so. That's what I'm trying to say. And basically, this is stuff like what's impossible to do in peacetime becomes possible to do when everybody can see that you have to do it. So, on the other hand, if Mr. Carney is successful between now and July 21 in getting this for landing, which is we're going to pay a pro forma 10% tariff, and we're going to have 25 and 50% tariffs on key sectors unless they're CUSMA compliant, if that's the deal, and I think that's kind of what we're hoping for, then the issue is going to tone down. And then he's going to have to show that he can be a normal Canadian prime minister. But in those circumstances, I think things will be more difficult for him. Now, look, if I could just sneak in, since you guys want to drift it into politics and talk about my battered little tribe here, I will say this about the New Democrats. There's almost 200 of them in elected provincial legislatures, twice the number of Liberals. They're the government in British Columbia, the official opposition in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the government in Manitoba, official opposition in Ontario and in Nova Scotia. The NDP is going through its usual cycle where it's quite strong provincially and got clobbered federally, for sure. And they're the kindlings federally for them to finish the job. Okay, I can see a scenario where the federal party is so weak that it can't fight off its, let's say, its performative wing. And in those circumstances, they will finish the job. But if they can thread through this, and it's going to be an internal debate between now and next spring, basically, and get somebody sensible as a leader, then the political repositioning that you've been talking about does open a big flank for them. And they might be looking at a fundamentally different opportunity in a future election.
Sure, you want to run Gary Dewar against Mark Carney. That's one thing, right? But
I think Mr. Carney in wartime is unbeatable. Mr. Carney in peacetime, bringing in, forgive me for saying this, you guys, a Paul Martin budget and basically contesting the center right with the weakened Polyev, then I think at least there's an opportunity for the Democrats to get their clothes back, okay, by mounting a progressive criticism and speaking to cross-pressured Liberal NDP voters, many of whom voted for the Liberals in the last election, basically just to block Polyev. And so you're in a different ballgame. And that's the thing you guys all know, okay, which is that every election is a new ballgame and it all looks different again. And this is how you go from 2 MLAs in British Columbia to being the current government. It's how you go from 2 MLAs in Alberta to being the Notley government. It's how, how you go from no party status for almost a decade in Ontario to 30% of the vote under, in Ontario, getting party status back. Like, parties are hard to kill. The only real people who can kill a party are themselves. You can kill yourself by having a civil war and deciding to shoot each other in the head. And that may be with the fate for the federal NDP, but it doesn't have to be.
Right. Right. Ian, so many things have been said that have your blood pressure. But Brian now is able to go to barbecues and cocktail parties for the summer and be fine. He was worried about that. And I think it's important to be able to do that. So I'm fine. But now I want to let you give a chance to talk, but I want to throw this thought into your head because I'm quite curious about it, which is I really don't think Carney could have been more clear that he thinks that government money is going to be involved in these big projects. And that's why he's divided up the budget between investment and consumption. and that's why he talks about the catalyzing role um, of the federal government in all this. I think he thinks these projects won't happen without federal money, and so de-risking or catalyzing, as he might say, whatever. And I'm really interested in how the small C conservatives in Canada are going to react to that.
Well, where to start? Yes, you're probably right about that. Let me go back to your point about 95. In the middle of the Chrétien government, Mr. Chrétien handed the finance portfolio to the guy from the Montreal big business community, from the Mount Stephen Club or whatever it's called, Canada Steamship Lines and so forth, and ran
Mount Royal Club.
Mount Royal Club, the big business Montreal fiscal policy, which was right for the country at the time. Again, that's not a criticism. But the little guy from Shawinigan was the prime minister in charge, and he kept the rest of the government close to a kind of a populist, not a especially big business agenda. We now have to extend the analogy. You know, the former double central bank governor from Brookfield board of directors as the prime minister, and I don't see the kind of the populist side of the Liberal Party showing through in the government here, except maybe in its appeal to a very anti-Israel or skeptical to Israel foreign policy, which is not the traditional, I don't think, roots of the Liberal Party in that regard. Nonetheless, I think you're right. The bet here is on big government financing together with big business financing at a time when we are months, weeks, maybe a year away from a big fiscal crisis, debt crisis in the United States, which is going to hit across the public sector borrowing potential of all governments across the Western world, regardless of how well managed they've been fiscally or not. And so as a result, this idea that somehow, you know, you get the multi-billion-dollar government purchase for modular homes is a crazy bet. Brian is wrong. The problem with housing in this country is that government controls development permitting, controls all of the building regulations for housing and so forth, and adds in energy and accessibility and all of these expensive requirements for housing. I think in the end, we might regret that the one policy Mr. Carney's not going to take from the Conservatives is Mr. Poilievre's idea that we just let the levels of government that have the tools here manage to undo all of the problems they've injected into the housing crisis here, and to hold transfer payments hostage to force change at the local and the provincial government level as a way of avoiding a looming debt crisis to start in the United States. Every issuer on the planet is trying to borrow as much money as they can before the big bills come from the United States to suck up all of the remaining liquidity in the bond market. This is a very serious crisis that's coming. And so the idea that government is going to be the catalyst here, and the government financing, it's in a sense an admission of failure. The federal government had to buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline in order to get it moved, because nobody in the private sector would invest in a Canadian pipeline in that. And again, on Brian, I hate to disagree with Brian here. We can, you know, increase by 50% our trade with Europe over the next 5 years. So it doesn't replace the United States as an economic partner or as a security partner, for that matter. The auto industry in central Canada has been in long-term decline since at least the beginning of this century. Where the federal government has been in the problem here is emissions cap, clean fuels standard, clean electricity standard, oil tanker ban, so on and so forth. All that stuff's got to come out in order to let the potential growth of the economy from the resource sector carry the economy forward into the future here. And that's not, if you know, federal government has to step in to finance that, that's an admission that we've become, in effect, an uninvestable place for international investors. It's an admission that the last 10 years has really hurt Canada's economic standing in the world, and our ability to attract investment is a good place to invest for resource projects.
Maybe it is, Ian, but is resources the only thing we need to be investing in?
Resources,
I understand that partially because of the forcefulness of Danielle Smith, that the pipeline discussion has dominated the what will these national projects be, and it appears clear that a oil pipeline will be part of the national projects. But Carney keeps trying to say that's not the only thing, right?
Well, Look, independent of some crazy government policy, resource projects, not just oil and gas, but all sorts of mining projects and agriculture projects, are the highest value added part of the Canadian economy. They're the part that adds value the most. And they're the part that creates productivity for the Canadian worker and high incomes for Canadian blue collar workers. That's just what drives the Canadian economy. Now, you can try to hobble that with some kind of oil and gas emissions cap. You can try and hobble that with some $200, $300, $800 a ton carbon sequestration project and say we're going to only sell decarbonized barrels of oil, whatever that means. Maybe the economics of that is better than I think it is. But the current estimates before anything gets built are pretty atrocious there. And as the project gets built and the technology works itself out, I think the price is only going to get higher. Yes, it's possible we could turn our resource sector into an economic laggard here. But if you want, we have 10 years of projects that haven't been built that are waiting to be built. Yes, we need more natural gas exports. We need to double our oil production in Canada. I think that's an entirely reasonable estimate, and that's an entirely reasonable project to get going in the next 10 years that will create wealth. And that includes all sorts of uranium in Saskatchewan, all sorts of minerals across the country. We got to get that moving while we wait for the fantasy economy of some intangible economic growth in some future tech sector to get underway. If you want it to move quickly, it's going to be on the natural resources that have always been the historic strength of the Canadian economy. Good for unionized workers and good for shareholders.
Tim, is that the way you see it, or are there other non-oil and gas related projects that you think are exciting from a Canadian national project point of view?
Yeah, you'll be unsurprised to know that maybe there are a few others. Look, the resource sector has, it's an interesting question, right? When you look at actually productivity in the Canadian economy, there's some challenges to it. But one of the areas that actually has been challenged is oil and gas. Enormous productivity growth, for 20 years ago, and then kind of flat for the last 20. Now, is there an opportunity there? Yes. Is there an opportunity in critical minerals? Yes. But is there an opportunity in other sectors? Of course there is, right? I think, Canada actually is a significant player in the AI industry. We've got some great, tech companies, gaming.
Copper and natural gas, Tim.
Yes. Sorry, what's that?
Copper and natural gas.
Isn't that a resource?
Yeah, AI, it's copper and natural gas.
No, I said critical minerals, I think.
Yeah.
So, I'm trying to be less partisan than some. I do think that, so there are, and the reality is, when you look at our economy and the kinds of things people do, we're going to have the diversified set of investments to make, growth occur in areas where people are and where they have the experience and education and opportunity, the kinds of things people need. So it's not it's not just one thing. It's got to be many things. And actually, you see some of that on the list. Unquestionably, the big major economic infrastructure investments that the provinces are advancing are the ones actually where government checks are going to be part of what makes it work, because the private sector can't do it. Even some of the critical mineral stuff, we can't get to market because the resources, the infrastructure isn't there at an efficient economic level, especially when you got China who manipulates the market in response to opportunities in other countries to advance it. So you're going to need to invest in the kinds of things that create the opportunity, and that's government's going to do. The private sector could easily, you've had this ring of fire opportunity with all the resources up there. It's never been developed. Why? Because it's not because the private sector isn't interested. It can't make it work economically. It can work, and so we need enabling investments. You actually look at the United States, the entire how much defense spending has created the economic engine of the US. It's government spending that's been able to do that. And the notion that somehow government is an appropriate enabler of economic success is nonsensical in the Canadian context. And so I think there are, you see, energy in particular, right? But of electricity generation, electricity transmission is a huge opportunity. Nuclear actually, is a significant area where Canada was an early leader. Yes, it plateaued. China and Russia are doing their own, but Canada has the technology. Brookfield
Isn't
is a
that
part
one of the
owner, another
biggest
one.
fucking mistakes of the Trudeau government? Like, what was their anti-nuclear posture for the first
It
half?
was, yeah,
I mean, like, you couldn't mention the word nuclear in that
yeah, it was,
government. Their green bonds, nuclear wasn't eligible. It was
yeah,
not part of the fix. And if we'd made investments 10 years ago, we might have a plant coming on stream right now,
yeah. Well, we
right?
actually do. So just,
Happily, Ontario does.
Yeah.
well, I mean, and just to blow the horn of the company whose orange vest is on the chair over there. I mean, we are the construction company that's been hired to build the SMR, right?
Yeah.
So in Darlington, and so I mean, to be honest with you, we look, south of the border, and the opportunities there in nuclear energy because of the experience built in Ontario, huge opportunity there, right? And so I think there are lots of opportunities to enable the Canadian economy grow. I agree that the industrial part of our economy has been under challenge. There's a bunch of reasons for that. That may require some investment support. I mean, I don't know. Do you build a Canadian car? That's a big swing, and that's a lot of investment for one idea. But
Or why can't we
it's
buy a Chinese car for the 50 cents they charge for them now? If
it's
we can't
incredible,
make
eh?
if we can't sell cars into the United States, why aren't we able to buy a BYD?
Yeah, so that's
BYD.
that's
Yeah.
that's the big geopolitical question at some point. Like if we back to Brian's point about where we end up on a deal with the US, right? If we get an okay-ish deal, that becomes impossible. If we're shut off by the Americans, then the kinds of things we might be open to change.
There's the heart of the matter right there.
Okay.
So it's that, and I agree with a lot of you're saying here, Tim. The we can bray about how other trade arrangements are not going to replace the Americans as much as we want. This is an externality that we're not in control of here. We have the president of the United States saying, "You have nothing we need." Who's acting on it? And we were just joking about copper and natural gas.
Monetizing hegemony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're just joking about copper and natural gas. Trump this week just talked about putting a 200% tariff on copper imports to the United States. Okay. And I don't know who the free traders are in the United States anymore. Let's be clear, this whole agenda, tariff agenda, was lifted by Steve Bannon from the left of the Democratic Party that has been talking about this for 30 years. I don't know who in Congress, who is going to be president, who is going to argue that the economic future of the working people of America lies in free trade. So the reality with which we must deal, and there might be an exemption for energy exports into the United States, we'll see. But the reality for most of the Canadian economy is that it appears the United States is determined to lock us out of their market to some level, to some extent anyway. And so we are driven to diversify whether we like it or not. And is that going to happen by telling cities and provinces that we're cutting off their federal transfers if they don't accept whatever the latest rhyming slogan is from Dr. Zeus? I don't think that's an economic development plan. And so the reality in Canada is that things happen when government is partners with it, and that we may be, depending on the outcome of these negotiations now, compelled to seek new trade partners, even if we don't feel that that's convenient at the moment. And so then we are back to this point about that if you want that to happen, then you can't just say you want it and hope that it magically happens from investors who, as Ian is pointing out correctly, are going to be in a very pressured debt market in the next 24 to 36 months. So government is going to have to lead, and on at least strategically lead on strategic areas. If you want the diversification infrastructure that we need, then the government is going to have to make it happen. And it's not wrong to try to stretch your dollar by seeing whether you can use public capital as trigger capital to attract private investment. Certainly, I think there's debt available when you've de-risked it, but I don't think there's any other policy instruments available, and we will be driven to this, whether we like it or not.
All right. That was deep and hard, profound, and demoralizing, and a whole bunch of other D's. Let's time goes so quickly. I want to end on a somewhat lighter note, but I think it's topical and interesting, which is the structure of this government. And I've got a few questions about the structure of this government. So As of this week, there is a chief of staff and a principal secretary in place on a permanent basis. What is the difference between those two jobs, Ian?
First of all, there's no such thing as a permanent chief of staff or permanent president.
Sorry.
To even discuss this is, you know that.
We all prove it.
This is not like a Senate appointment, David. Jeez. This is not like a Senate appointment. Look, the great thing about the titles is that they're flexible. I mean, in a sense, the chief of staff is the buck stops there before it goes to the PM, because the chief of staff has to sign for the hiring and firing. But in terms of who makes the decisions, it's entirely up to the people who are involved, their strengths and weaknesses. And by the way, consider they're less than a week on the job. I don't think they know that yet. So as a result, I don't think you can project that. Mr. Sabia has some strong financial sector and some public service experience. The political staff, I think, are still trying to find their way. What's going to matter here is not them, actually. What's not going to matter is not who the chief of staff is, but the prime minister's ability to decide where he wants to spend his time. The warning went out. He's prepared to fire people if they can't get results. That's a very, I think, welcome warning at the beginning of government taking over here. It'll now be up to him to decide who he fires and how quickly he fires people. There's more than enough people who have proven that they need firing, whether it's their fault or not. Sometimes you need to fire some people just to show everybody else that the pace of change and the pace of progress that he wants to make here. And I think the question is, well, the three of them, the triumvirate, the top here, the quadrumvirate, or whatever you want to call it, how quickly they're prepared to push people out if they find that they can't get results. That's not to say that you want a reign of terror where people aren't prepared to give good advice, or where people are prepared to sort of cover up problems along the way or tell the boss what they want to hear here. But in the end, you want to find people who can get results on behalf of the government. And it could be that some of those people at the very top are part of the group that needs to be fired. That's up to the prime minister to make a decision.
Right. Tim, how did you and Francis Fox divide up the responsibilities? He was principal secretary and you were the chief of staff.
So it was kind of a geographic division. I mean, he was kind of the special voice for Quebec, frankly, in the prime minister's office, and the administrative responsibilities rested on me. That to the degree to which you performed a kind of an interlocutory function, that was because Paul went out and just phoned whoever he wanted, but to the degree to which there was that function, that was more me. And then a couple of areas where Francis expressed an interest, we worked out an arrangement. We also had, as you know, a deputy chief of staff structure that was more significant, with more delegated responsibilities. Deputy chief of staffs was functional responsibilities than I think the Trudeau PMO ever had, right? Which the bureaucracy took some time to figure out, right? Because they were more used to a single point of authority, and we created multiple points of authority, and that confused them for a while. I would say the interesting question for me is not so much is both what Ian said, but also I think the big issue is the discipline the government will be able to center, right? The three people with an Order of Canada pin and David Lametti, whether they'll be able to resist playing in all the places that aren't a priority of the government, right? That's going to, because you've got a whole system that spent 10 years in a hierarchical, it goes to a point way for running a government. And for me, the question is, okay, a healthcare issue comes up. Where does that decision get made? Who makes that decision? How is it made? Does that actually, does the PMO says, well, that's the minister. Here's your, and you go talk to the minister. I'm not answering that question in question period. You get to make that decision. That is the implication of the point that Ian made, which is you can't deliver, you're fired, but you got to give them the tools and the authority to do that, right? And so that, to me, I don't know the answer. The good news is, like Marc-André Blanchard, the chief of staff, he's never actually run a political office before, but he has been CEO of a law firm, which is actually quite similar, which is a lot of the independent people under the rubric of a single
Having
entity.
done both jobs, Tim, which is more difficult?
It's always chief of staff.
I was happy to be chief of staff, but never wanted to be department head at the university. So
Yeah, same kind of thing, exactly. But so for me, that's the big question. It was interesting, I mean, you saw Michael Sabia's note to the public service of the broader community said the three things that I want to, focus, simplify, and accountable, which I think was a good message. The one thing that I think is still was a bit missing in that message was it's a chain accountability inside government, which is actually some of the problem of government. I'd like to actually see accountability be accountability for results going out into, you said you're going to produce this result with the policy and did it or did it not. And that to me is a measure that the government's got to figure out how it's going to put in place, because it's not clear to me that was an operating principle of the government in the last 10 years. And so I think they've got some hard mechanics of government work to do, which is difficult to do when you're running at a hard pace in a wartime effort at the same time.
Brian, on the curse of politics, Scott Reed and Corey Tenike and I were mulling about the fact that Marc-Andre Blanchard and David Lametti and Michael Sabia and the finance minister Champagne are all from Quebec, right? And we were talking about this, and then Jordan Likeness pointed out to us that they're all men. So, I mean, is that in any way a mistake? Like, are those jobs people should be looking for a little bit more representation in, or is this ankle biting?
Both. You look. I defer to my colleagues on. You guys have federal PMO experience, and I don't. I'll just give you a little provincial perspective, okay? In my experience, premiers' offices basically have a few jobs that they need to get done. You have an ops function, which is the trains running on time. You have a message outreach and strategy job, which is basically what are we saying, what are we doing? And you've got an oversight job. So just keeping an eye on government, on issues, and making sure that terrible mistakes are not made. In a small province like Saskatchewan, you can basically do that with two people. So I did when I worked in the Romano government. I was deputy chief of staff. My boss, Judy Samuelson, was chief of staff, and we divided up the work. Okay, and basically you could tackle it. In Alberta, we tried with two people in these roles, and then we did a 6-month review, and we were clear we didn't have enough bandwidth to do all the jobs we did, so we brought in a principal secretary. Okay, so we had a chief of staff, deputy chief of staff, and a principal secretary to get these things done. Think of part of the jobs that you're doing, for example, and I can think of some terrible mistakes that I've seen in government, okay, because basically ministers and their political staff and their officials asked for direction on stuff they were working on. The center was too busy with other things and didn't do it properly, so off they went doing their thing, and it turned out to be the mistake that cost you 10 points in the polls, okay? So that at the end of the day, you need to have enough bandwidth to do your oversight job. And I think that's essentially what we've got happening here, and what they're going to have to sort out. Somebody's going to have to be the ops person who is making sure the trains run on time, basically the Katie Telford job. Somebody is going to need to think about strategy and talking to provinces and outreach, basically the Jerry Butts job. And then somebody needs to keep an eye on the ministers and talking to caucus and to the party. And that's often what a principal secretary ends up doing. A big hat, a big title for your premier's office diplomat. All right? I think if that's where they sort themselves out, it'll go okay. Now, the fact that they're all from Quebec, speaking as a Montrealer, I think that's okay. That they are lightly experienced in politics, and that these are your main political thinkers, that could work in the war conditions that we've been talking about, where you're compelled to get things done. If we end up in peacetime, then you have to wonder whether they're going to be able to sort out how.
When you talk about lightly in politics, are you talking about the two people in the PMO? Because I would think of Sabia as, frankly, a very political clerk of the Privy Council.
Yes, that's true. Well, if the lead political strategist of this government ends up being the clerk, that's going to be a very interesting twist.
Well, wasn't that Alex Himmelfarb for a while?
Yeah,
so for me, the interesting.
That's how Chrétien lost his job.
So for me, the interesting, the
Sorry,
interesting question,
what other prime minister was served by Alex Himmelfarb?
Stephen Harper.
Briefly, but
Yeah.
Yes.
who else lost their job with Alex?
Well, no, sorry, it's the terminology you used. I don't think Paul was served by Alex Himmelfarb. I think Alex Himmelfarb was the clerk of the Privy Council when Paul Martin was the prime minister. Those are two different things altogether.
So for me, David, the interesting, I've got a different question, which is what I'm sitting here, when I look at the government right now, and to Brian's point. So when you look at the 10 seats the Liberals lost in the 401, right? And some of the sort of
NBC,
that kind of suburban New Canadian where crime and affordability were really hitting hard. The question I have is to the strategy question, right? Is who is the person in the government who's worried about that and solving that problem? And sitting here today, I don't know the answer to that question. I've asked a few people inside, and I don't. The people I've asked don't know the answer either. So I think that's one thing they're going to have to solve quickly if they want to keep doing.
They don't have anybody political at that level of politics
Yeah.
that I can see at a senior level, right?
Yeah. Which is weird.
Yeah.
Sure. Brian? What did you say?
Which is weird. Like, Mark Lalonde, I wrote a paper after being Pierre Trudeau's chief of staff, and he offered a formulation that I've always thought was very smart. He said that PMO is politically driven and policy sensitive, and PCO is policy driven and politically sensitive. And the prime minister needs these two pieces of advice. And I just think it remains to be seen whether this is a PMO that can sort through the political puzzles that confront any government that is aiming for, what is it, a fifth term?
You say that like it's exceptional.
Yeah. Brian, let me stop you. Have you ever worked for somebody, and I don't know this is true, but Carney's a different enough cat that this could possibly be true. What if he doesn't care about re-election?
Yeah.
What if he sees himself as a public servant who's got a job to do? He's going to come in and do it, and let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, but David, sorry, I've heard this. He may or may not. Who knows? I don't read the guy's mind. Everybody else in that caucus cares about getting reelected.
Yeah.
In particular, the guys who just got elected in 2025. They are not in this for one shot. I mean, I heard this about Poilievre. Oh, he's going to win the 2025 election. He doesn't care whether he gets reelected. Yeah. Everybody else in the caucus cares. So sooner or later, the prime minister cares about that because everybody else cares. Re-election is the name of the game. So it may be that he wants to retire. Okay, fine. But then there's going to be somebody running for the leadership after he's gone. I'm sorry, this idea of some other re-election doesn't matter. I don't buy that.
The boats that Mr. Carney has launched are not going to be, we've been talking about this, are not going to land in 12 to 18 months. All right. So even if at the end of the day, where he's coming from is a public service approach, if you will. I'm the head of the central bank with a different title. As head of the government of Canada. He needs more time than he has as prime minister in a minority parliament to do what he says he wants to do. So to pull off the agenda that he's laid out, much of which is quite sensible if we don't get essentially the status quo with the United States, then he's going to need another term. And from his perspective, preferably a majority term, particularly if he's serious about the fiscal restructuring he's talking about, which is going to open a big opportunity for the New Democrats. So in those circumstances, he's going to have to be political, and you have to wonder whether there's somebody there who can figure out a winning election campaign. But, as somebody said in this discussion, you shouldn't underestimate the Liberal Party. It's got a deep, it's got a deep bench of strategists.
This is a very, very, very good year to be using that quote.
Yes.
There have been years, Brian, when I had that quote in my pocket and I didn't bring it out.
Yeah.
Well, David,
is that they're not to be underestimated, but they are not unbeatable. And
yes, correct.
And so that keeps things interesting for the rest of us.
Well, maybe I could just follow up on Tim's comment or your question about the structure of the government and that all the seats that were lost along the 401 and the Lower Mainland.
Yeah.
In a sense, this speaks to, we've been talking from within the Liberal coalition, I mean, even me, to the Liberal coalition here of people who thought the last election was about Trump and we're at war and there's a crisis and the country's at stake and this big ignoble lie that Trump was going to annex Canada, which was nonsense, or he's going to invade, which served the purposes very well. But there's half the population that very clearly responded to that and voted for Mr. Carney. Then there's the other half of the population that doesn't see any of those things as issues at all, and are on what your polling shows: housing, cost of living, price of groceries, crime. Why can't I go on the subway or the LRT without feeling danger? And that's disproportionately people who are not in white communities in Canada and so forth. Those people are not part of the Liberal coalition and not part of the Liberal universe anymore. They're the people that think that Mr. Poilievre's a hero, and that Mr. Poilievre still thinks he's fighting for it, is fighting for. It's a 42% rather than a 46% coalition. But they're just, nobody in Mr. Carney's orbit is connected to any of those people, because in a sense, they're not in Mr. Carney's version of reality. They're beyond Mr. The people who are running this government. It's outside of their sphere of experience. They are in Mr. Poilievre's sphere of experience. They're in Doug Ford's sphere of experience, but it's not in Mr. Carney's world. That's the Achilles heel of the government. But that doesn't change my estimate that we're going to be years away from that catching up to them. But it's no surprise they don't have anybody who's paying attention to any of those issues. Those issues don't exist in Mr. Carney's world. They're not part of what got him to where he is, and they're not part of what's going to carry him forward.
I'm going to take a little bit of, I think he's politically astute enough. And in fact, I think he said a bit about crime during the campaign. Although,
Yes.
frankly, Liberals talking about crime during campaign is like, is when we're least credible on the issue. It's people just don't believe
It's a bad
us.
idea. It's like conservatives
Correct.
talking about healthcare. It's like,
Yeah.
stop. Right?
Yeah. So that being said, I think he's smart enough to know he's got to do something about it. The government has kind of made some noises around that issue. The question really is can he do enough and be seen to be doing enough that starts to track? Does he have the voices around him that ensure that it's calibrated properly, et cetera? That for me is the question. I think he's politically astute enough to be aware of both affordability and crime as issues that he needs to address. Spoke to them during the campaign. The question is, does he have the political operational skill around him to deliver that reduces the cogency of those from an electoral perspective? That I don't know sitting here today.
But in the early going, if you look at how, because we're some months past the election now, you look at where we are at today. What you see is that having very nicely rounded up Jagmeet's supporters in fear of Mr. Poilievre, they are now on the hunt for the Conservative coalition, and so it's somewhat contrary to what you're saying.
I don't think it's political. I really don't think it's political.
But let me just finish it. It's what they're doing, whether it's political or not. Okay, is he is eating the Conservative lunch, and you can see from the numbers, that the Tories are down in the 30s now. The Libs are in the mid 40s. The Prime Minister is leading Mr. Poilievre by almost 20 points. So they've been doing a very effective job in the early going, in these circumstances, with these threats in the air, of dismantling the Conservative coalition, and quite contrary to the theory that they don't understand it and it doesn't live in it. They seem to be quite focused on eating it, and you could see a circumstance where the Carney government in a future election, moves 10 points over, drops 10 points of New Democrats, and picks up 10 points of Conservatives with the kind of governing that they're doing now.
We're going over as we always do, but you guys have taken me to a point where I need to ask this question about cabinet government, because on this crime issue, and Carney promised cabinet government. Everybody promises cabinet government, I guess. Carney promised cabinet government. I thought that his mandate letter, was encouraging in that regard, because it was relatively unprescriptive and more go out and do your job than previous ones had been. But I don't know anything about this government that Mark Carney hasn't told me personally.
Yeah.
Right? I haven't heard anything authoritative about this government from any other voice. So who's going to explain the crime package to me? Him?
He doesn't have it. I mean, there's nobody in the Liberal Party who could speak to what needs to be done on the tough on crime stuff. And this is why Mr. Carney is apparently looking outside the Liberal Party for some help here. His tough on crime package will be explained by Doug Ford. who's pretty good on this. And if he's smart, he'll get somebody else from Ontario to help with that. God knows his justice minister and his public safety minister can't speak to the tough on crime stuff. There is he's trying to portray a picture where he's going to make all the big directional decisions, and then ministers are going to be left to implementation. This is in fact the way government works. Has always worked. There's no change in that. When it works, that's the way it works. The Prime Minister always makes the big decisions because there's always money and big political relationships that affect the future of the government at stake, and you can't leave that to an individual minister.
I guess so. I kind of half agree, I guess, because ultimately, yes, more so over time, the Prime Minister has made the big decisions. But I actually think government is more effective, both politically and actually, when it has ministers who have prominence, who have ability to drive agendas, who actually have seemed to have their own views. And they have to trim their sails to the direction of the Prime Minister a bit, but I think that actually is a better government, and actually both because it creates other avenues for other ideas to get in and be considered, but also I think politically it allows the government to occupy more parts of the spectrum and to have people say, well, I might not like that view, but I've got this person's voice in cabinet around that table and I have access to them. And and he's got. So Tim Hodgson has that potential on the economic issue for him, which is good. But I agree with you. I don't know who carries some of these other important political issues, and then related to that is who tells them what the confines of the strategy they need to execute is.
Right. The public doesn't know who any of the ministers are, even when they are busy. But the root of the problem that this government had, we've been discussing, was she's only now appointing his senior political staff.
Yeah, it's late.
And what we saw in the first weeks of this government, before they were all told to shut up, was what happens in a cabinet when there's no center and the ministers are all talking off the top of their heads. So you had a period of cacophony. Then they were told to be quiet. The Prime Minister was occupying the public stage. Now you have a PMO that's in place that is going to think about their communications grid, to use the British phrase, and that's going to start calling the place. And if they're smart, what they will then do is they will start to script roles for their ministers, where the ministers will carry some of the balls. And you don't want to overexpose your leader. You don't want to take all the risks with the leader. So for the best communication purposes, I think if they get their act together and they understand politics and the game, then they will set up a grid and you will start to see ministers leading files. But what you can't do is just let them all rip and say whatever they have off the top of their minds. We saw what that looked like for a week or two, and it wasn't a good look.
I don't think he liked it. All right, I'm going to have to let you go. I've promised you that I'd only keep you for an hour, and it's been an hour and 15 minutes now. But I feel like this could go on forever. And so maybe on the 10th, we gather in person and we don't have a time limit. We just sit around and shoot the shit till we're done.
Okay,
great.
Right? Okay.
Sounds good.
Let's do that.
Right. Yeah.
Listen, thanks so much for squeezing us in this week. Great to hear you. I mean, I think it's a dynamic new time in Canadian politics, and there's a lot that can go right or wrong, and I really, really appreciated having the three of you here to help sort it out. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
David.
Oh, wow.
All right. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN, and Fidelity Investments Canada. All you Herle Burly-ites who watch or listen to the show, these three people are fucking gold. Thank you, guys.
Herle Burly, Herle Burly.